Good afternoon. My name is Reiley, and I'm the Business of Food reporter at the Washington Post. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining us via Zoom today. In the interest of public health and in accordance with CDC guidelines, the council's made the decision to cancel all of their in-person public events through at least June 5th. So please go ahead and check the council's website and social media pages for updates, as well as for new podcasts, events, blogs, and research. Now on to our main topic for today, something that we didn't know anything about 4 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago for most of us. But COVID-19's already had a large-scale impact on our food system, affecting everything from supply chains and markets to agriculture production and the labor force. In the face of system shocks, how are companies responding to the rise in consumer demand, and what are the lasting impacts? We'll discuss this over the next 40 minutes or so. In about 20 minutes, we'll incorporate your questions, so please turn your browser to ccga.live to submit a question or to vote for questions that you like particularly, so they move up the chain. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our two panelists to this conversation. Sanjeev Krishnan serves as the Chief Investment Officer and Managing Director of S2G Ventures, and he's been with the firm since its inception. He has nearly 20 years of experience in sourcing, executing, managing, and exiting venture and private equity investments, including a focus in agriculture and food companies. And our second panelist today is Sara Menker. She's the CEO and founder of Grow Intelligence. Prior to its founding, she was a vice president in Morgan Stanley's commodities group, where she covered all commodity markets, and subsequently moved to trading, where she managed an operations trading portfolio. Sanjeev and Sara, thanks so much for joining us. And I'm sure it's a very busy month for both of you. So I guess the first question to both of you, as we've seen in our grocery stores and across the globe, the coronavirus has disrupted shipping, supplies, consumer demand. Some estimates have shown that supplies are ample, but empty shelves suggest otherwise. So let's have a little bit of a discussion about what points in the food chain have you seen are likely in the most distress?
Sir, do you want me to go or?
Yeah, go ahead, Sanjeev.
No, I mean, we have over 45 companies in our portfolio. So we have and some of those are in farm gate, so genetics, fertilizer, pesticide companies, all the way to consumer product good companies, and we even have a company that does sort of e-grocery. So I feel like and then we also have over sort of 100 co-investors. Half of them are strategics that we're talking to. So, sort of folks from Cargill to Bunge, Tyson to Kellogg, Syngenta to Bayer and others. So a lot of the market participants that kind of feed the world, if you will. We've seen tremendous impact from this. In the grocery side, most of the large grocers that I've spoken with, same store comps are up 200 to 300%. Normally in a district center, you have 4 weeks of supply. I talked to a grocer that had less than a week of supply. Everyone on the grocery side feels very comfortable that there is, supply chain. A lot of this is pull forward demand. So they don't know. I haven't heard any, in my conversations or in our discussions across the value chain, any concern about, longevity of that supply chain. I think medium term, there's a concern around ports and labor availability and some other things that I'm sure Sara will get into. Food service has been incredibly impacted. So a lot of out-of-home eating has been incredibly impacted, and we do have some companies exposed to that sector, and we've seen that a lot of them are either trying to transition into serving retail customers or others. In terms of consumer product good companies, you've seen tremendous forward demand pull. What we've seen typically, I think, is again, I talked to a lot of the CPG companies, and their sales are similarly up, 150 to 250% relative to last year, and they feel like they're trying to just keep all their factories running and make sure that, workers in those factories are healthy and effectively, continue to go through the supply chain. It's just some anecdotal, like this week, we're probably going to hit an all-time high in U.S. egg pricing. Last week, or the week before last, we had the all-time high in food trucking miles. So, in terms of Americans continue to have access to food, the supply chain is working around the clock. It's been deemed an essential industry. As we get closer to the farm gate, weather determined and labor determined, both really important things, I think, right now, is there tends to be some defiance, in rural America about this. And in fact, a lot of non-correlation behavior. People are continuing to do spring planting, and a lot of it will depend on sort of weather forces that I think Sara will go into. But we don't see as much of an impact right now in terms of Midwest, agriculture. I think some of the things that were occurring in California or on produce, particularly access to labor, is going to continue to be an issue in the produce aisle. I think in the protein aisle, it seems like the system is working, but obviously there's a lot of reserves that people have, and so continue to have access to food grade crops like wheat and other things will be important. And we'll know more of that impact, I think, probably 3 or 4 months. So in terms of where we sit in the landscape, it seems like the supply chain's working. There's tremendous pull forward demand. And I think finally, I'll end with this. I think in our e-grocery business, that has grown tremendously. People are on 2-3 hour waits. Instacart announced, I think they're going to hire 100,000 new people this year. And I think this will change the consumer behavior around how they potentially shop for groceries and food down the road.
Sanjeev, you mean it'll change their behavior permanently? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think it depends a lot on the next 2 to 4 months and how long this lasts. The biggest thing we struggle with as an investment firm, but is this structural or is this cyclical? We don't have the answers. We're trying to ask that question as much as we can in as many different ways we can ask that. I think that will largely determine is this something that, in December, if we sit back in December, that we all look back on and sort of looked at as, have some scar tissue, but it's not permanent, or is this something structural? And we're not yet. It's too much. It's too new right now to have, I think, for us, a determination of whether that's structural.
Great. All right, Sara, how about you? What is your answer to that?
Well, Sanjeev covered a lot. I think, he made a point as he was kind of explaining the demand pressures that retailers are facing, and then the surge in demand that they're seeing, and inventory. I think it touches on a really important point, which is the food supply chain had learned to become so efficient, and everybody was always kind of essentially maximizing for margin in whichever way you're doing it, that inventories had started to also get to pretty low levels, i.e. 4 weeks versus 1 week, but 4 weeks itself is relatively low to where it used to stand. And so this type of event occurred at a time when the overall inventory model had essentially shifted to assuming that we'll always be able to procure what we need when we need it. And that's both domestically within the US, but also globally, i.e., when you take kind of a step back and think of supply chains on a global scale, a lot of the disruptions have been around shipping. And so, in the US, if you think of the relationship that exists, it's, West Coast to East Coast, or, across the Midwest into the East Coast. But as you start to think of across oceans and relationships that are happening there, having ports essentially shut down in parts of South America when they're at the peak of their growing season, and Chinese demand is starting to ramp up again, it starts to have some implications on just overall global supply and demand balances on, especially grains and oil seeds, the kind of more commodity crops that are traded globally through shipping networks. And so there's definitely a lot of inventory drawdown occurring. So similar to the supermarkets, you're basically seeing that same sort of inventory drawdown occurring across countries. And so how that plays itself out in terms of rebalancing, both through production that's, coming into the market now in places that are in their growing season. So again, Brazil, Argentina, Russia, Ukraine, etc. But those countries have also been, hit really hard by the oil crisis, and their currencies have been, hit pretty hard, which has some implications to global trade and trade balances. So it's not a lack of supply, but there's certainly all sorts of dislocations on prices that are driven by logistical bottlenecks that have been created. So that's one area where we've been focused a lot on.
So before we went on, you said you had a particular concern about vegetables or specialty crops. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on why you think they're in a more vulnerable position, or what are the factors there that might make supply disruptions more likely?
Well, Sanjeev touched on it a little bit, but labor, right? Labor is a big issue. Unlike row crops, fresh produce, a lot of it is still harvested manually. So you facing labor issues means that you might actually have the crops available and the fresh produce ready to go, but not enough people to harvest it at the pace that you need it. And also the perishability of the products versus grains and oil seeds that you can store and you can afford to have essentially, hanging around until some of these bottlenecks free up. You don't have that same sort of luxury in the fresh produce world. And so there's going to be some shifts around probably how we think about fresh produce production. I've been spending a lot of time thinking of, how people are going to start probably appreciating their food very differently, meaning when you go to a supermarket and realize something's not on a shelf and you ask why, and you find out that, oh, this thing, these avocados come in from Mexico, or, whatever it is. You'll start to kind of, I think the US consumer in particular has been used to finding anything and everything you want on the shelf at all times. That's kind of the general mindset. The mindset might turn into more seasonal, and it might have to become that. It will also, logistical networks and distribution will also probably work differently.
I think just to build on that, if I could, we're seeing some outside the US even, Malaysia shut its border with Singapore, and it's caused the government of Singapore, and they reached out to some of our portfolio companies around indoor ag, just to build that, capacity internally. So you may see some new innovation that spurs out of it, particularly around like decentralized production models, in case, some border closures or access to ports or airplanes, cargo planes, it becomes impacted. The question I have, though, is ultimately, and this is true not just in food and ag, but more broadly, is who's going to bear the extra cost? Because to Sarah's point, we've built a fairly globalized supply chain in food and ag, produce, protein, et cetera, et cetera. And that's largely resulted in a consumer benefit around, especially in the US, we pay some of the lowest cost for food globally on a percentage of, total income. And is there going to be a risk premium associated with it, whether the government bears it or the consumer ultimately bears it, for a more resilient supply chain? And this is going to be true in healthcare as much as it's true in food and ag and other sort of super sensitive industries that we may want to figure out how to build. And I don't think it's just the US. I think governments like Singapore are thinking about it, how to build resilient supply chains that are more resilient to shocks like this.
And I would say the US is probably one of the most resilient in the world on a relative basis, because it does produce enough of a diverse basket of product, from fresh produce to protein to, kind of your grains, oil seeds, etc. It's probably one of the most resilient, and it still has its own, issues.
So going back to the labor pool, I mean, I know that there's the suspension of H-2A visas presents problems, but if we're talking about, a domestic labor force that may see unemployment of, 30% or something like that, is it reasonable to think that there might be a reallocation, or that there might be more domestic farm laborers this next year? Or is that just a pipe dream?
I mean, I've been investing in this space since 2003, and in 2008, 2009, we saw lots of unemployment, and there was not a lot of interest by Americans to do those jobs, at least in the data. I mean, and certainly you never know. The one thing we are seeing, though, is a lot more interest by some of these producers of produce in robotics. So we've got an investment in a robotics company that helps with harvesting, and they're sold out now, because to Sarah's point, they're all sort of trying to find sort of hacks or alternatives short term to the availability of labor. It's going to become a real issue in protein production and produce production and food manufacturing as well.
Absolutely. So Sarah, I have a question for you. So tell a little bit about Grow Intelligence and what it does, and the COVID-19 monitoring kit that you've developed. What is it? What are its objectives?
Yeah, so Grow Intelligence, we're a software company, and we've built a platform that ingests just large disparate data sets that have anything to do with global ag. And we've essentially built an insight engine around that data. And so to give you perspective, what counts as agricultural data on our platform can be anything from climate, environmental, soil type data to demographic data or FX rates that actually impact the demand side. So it's very broad in terms of what we actually cover. We're looking at over 55 million unique kind of indicators linked to global ag in the system, and we're processing hundreds of trillions of data points every day. And in doing that, that means that it gives us this unique ability to think of the interplay between supply, demand, trade, and ultimately price for any combination of products anywhere in the world, right? And so when COVID-19, when it became apparent that the hit that COVID-19 was going to have on our economies and the impact it was just going to have on society, we put together a kit using the data that's in the platform that said, here's the framework by which we would think of supply, here's the framework by which we think of demand and trade, and here's how it translates to price. And all of these components are moving so fast, and so depending on whether you care about corn or soybeans, or you really care about sugar and peanuts, you can essentially use that same framework just by changing the crop and country combinations. And what we tried to do was provide a series of public educational kind of webinars showing people how they can connect some of these dots, and then how you start to customize that to your supply chain or to your country, depending on what lens you're looking at it from. And so it was just a way of trying to educate the public around how do you start to interpret what's happening, but also how do you keep a real-time pulse check, because things are moving so fast. So what we said last week could be completely irrelevant this week, but there are some kind of core fundamental themes that are in play. And let's not forget that this is also happening at the same time as, African swine fever had kind of hit in China, but it's now been discovered in Germany. And so the protein supply chains as they were had already been under a lot of stress and changing pretty rapidly. And you just have a confluence of events that are hitting at multiple fronts. And so it was just a way to help people access both our predictive models that, are predicting and forecasting supply of these crops in countries that are currently growing them, to just connecting the dots.
Great. So, and Sanjeev, so S2G invests from soil to shelf. Speak to how COVID-19 is impacting your portfolio companies. What kind of changes are you making?
We take a systems view of the whole food system in the U.S., and we're trying to make the food system in the U.S. more sustainable and more healthy. So we're investing across the value chain. So ag tech, from genetics to digital ag and ag fintech, to food tech, so a lot of ingredient technologies, to supply chain tech, and then consumer product goods companies and even last mile delivery companies as well. I would say it's COVID-19 is having a tremendous impact. We're a venture capital firm, so we rely on risk capital, and when things like this happen, the capital markets shift from risk on to risk off. So that impacts our company's ability to access capital. So that's ubiquitous across our that's going to impact all our firms. I would say we have 4 buckets of impact. One bucket is a lot of accelerated demand, and some of our companies are benefiting from what I talked about earlier, which is Americans are buying food. and they're buying food at a rate that is more similar to Thanksgiving and Christmas, even beyond that in many cases. And so that's having a positive revenue impact. Our general view is this is short term. It's sort of a boom bust. And so we're not really allocating our businesses in any way to think this demand is going to stay around for this long, but it's having a positive impact on a number of those companies. Some companies are uncorrelated. So they're continuing, or some of our companies are continuing selling pesticides, biopesticides, biofertilizer, new seeds, et cetera, to farmers and to ag retailers. That seems to be relatively, to date anyway, uncorrelated. There's a group of companies that are too early to tell. It will have some impact, positive or negative, but they're removed enough where it's not sure that I know how much of an impact they're going to have. And there's a group of companies that are very exposed to this. So, they either have fundings they're trying to get done, which could be impacted by it, as I talked about. Or they sell to food service. A good chunk of the revenues are, or things like this where they were doing something innovative, and that innovation is deprioritized in a time like this because people are focused on the urgent as opposed to the important. I think overall, to be honest with you, everyone eats, and overall, we expect food and ag as a sector to be resilient, and the food and ag sort of innovation sector to be as resilient. I was on a phone call earlier from this board meeting we had with a lot of strategics, and there was, there wasn't the same sort of the panic and sort of anxiety I felt in 01, 02 as an investor, and then 08, 09 in the food and ag landscape isn't as dramatic because of the resilient nature of the demand that I'm seeing.
Great. So I'd like to ask both of you kind of how, because the food system is so kind of interconnected and international, with all of these kind of internal closed borders or the Schengen countries or Mexico or whatever, how might these closed borders impact supply chain and labor in all the different directions?
So a lot of what you're seeing on closed borders are trying to protect trade in that. So they'll explicitly actually mention that they're trying to ensure that trade remains, and even on flights that cargo can come in and out. Now the difficulty is obviously some of the way that cargo is shipped, even on flights, requires passengers as well, and so depending on what you're looking at, that can be impacted. So it depends on what crop you're looking at, right? What types of crops, and if you're looking at shipping versus air freight products, there's going to be two very different sets of impacts, and then where the product is coming from. So, products coming out of Italy, for example, it's just that's the entire country's on lockdown. So even if there's technically the ability to move product around, there's just not a production of it. And so depending on, which market, I've been talking a lot about looking at, EVOO, extra virgin olive oil markets and how that would be impacted because the combination of Italy and Spain, two major producers being hit hard. So I think it largely will depend.
So Sanjeev, what do you think are the biggest food security challenges? I mean, are there particular pieces of it that you find that you think are going to be the most difficult for us to overcome with COVID-19?
I mean, I think, if you're in the structural camp that this changes everything, or changes quite a bit, is I think you've got to think about what Sara mentioned. We had a just-in-time, highly efficient, globalized supply chain. Where there's studies that show that the world kind of has a certain sort of inventory of supply chain at any one time. Sara, I'd probably defer to Sara on what that time frame is, but someone quoted to me 30 days of supply. I don't know if that's probably, if that's the right number or not. That is not in a sort of, if you think this is a structural event, and more events are going to happen like this, and just political incentives as they are, you're going to build resiliency. Now, who pays for that resiliency? Because that's a tax on the system, is going to be what we need to talk about with other we do it through public policy, or we have consumers pay more for food. So I think that's a fundamental thing. I think there will be a lot of innovation that will come out of this that will make the system more resilient, whether it's indoor agriculture, whether it's cellular agriculture, whether it's decentralized sort of protein systems and alike. And so I expect that.
Pause right there. Explain what you mean by decentralized protein systems. What is that?
So, in animal protein, like people are pitching us right now, like we can create a more there's all. That's actually an interesting question. So there's animal protein, we invest in animal protein, better for animal protein, from a sustainability perspective, plant-based protein, as well as cellular protein. And we are seeing a lot more interest in cell-based meat as a result of this. Some of it was this because of the African swine flu had a dramatic impact in China. And the global protein system felt that. Was not just in China. So prior to this, we walked into the African swine flu issue, and it created a lot of interest in cellular-based protein, which is effectively growing chicken and pork and beef and other things in either a bioreactor or a fermenter, and then effectively selling it as that protein. A lot of it was ground-based as opposed to like scaffolded with like a steak. So there's a lot of interest in that. Continued interest we're seeing in plant-based protein. That's again, some of those supply chains are global, but there's a real interest in how do you make that a little more decentralized, so you can between the journey between supply and demand becomes compressed. And
so are we going to run out of, in light of all the plant-based, are we going to run out of pea protein? Is there any risk in terms of? Also a lot of the pea protein, depending on which company we're talking about, ostensibly is organic,
Yeah.
and like what is, I just can't imagine. It seems like that's a finite, quantity.
Yeah, we actually own a yellow pea processor to one of our companies, and I have a company that works on upcycling some of that protein. Again, we haven't seen it yet. I know China is a large source of that, and there were issues and concerns right during January and February about access. It opened up again, sort of end of February, and so right now, Sara probably has better data than me. I just have this anecdotal data through our portfolio companies, but right now I'm not seeing issues with that. But I do think it'll be interesting to see if these decentralized models, whether it's indoor ag for produce and some of the cellular-based cultivated meat and plant-based meat can start to differentiate themselves in terms of supply chain resiliency.
So with cell-based, is there anything close to market? I've heard just off the record, that 2021 there might be some coming on board at the very end of 2020. But in terms of scaling, or in terms of having a price point that's even remotely comparable to traditional, when do you think that we're going to start seeing that kind of in the grocery store?
Yeah, so we have an investment in that space called Future Meat, and they've just built their own first pilot scale facility that's commercial though. And so they're planning to have product end of this year. I think a lot of the first products for cell-based meat will be hybrid products with, similar to sausages. Sausages actually have plant-based, in them, and they have soy usually, and as well as meat. So you see that. I think where we're looking for is less than $10 a kilo of production, and then eventually, $3 to $4 a kilo to really compete with commodity meat. And we are actually more confident than we were last year that by sort of mid next year to end of next year, some of these companies will get there, including our company, Investment Future Meat. We want to do probably more in that space than less, or we're looking to make other investments in that space. And things like this cause, real reflection, particularly with governments like in Singapore or China, to say we need an all-the-above strategy for protein.
Sure. So Sara, in terms of kind of innovation, Sanjeev talked about it a little bit about kind of innovations preventing future challenges like this one. Are there any pieces that you think are the key things to focus on in terms of innovation?
Well, I'm biased, but I think information matters. But I say that in a genuine way, in the sense that so much of the ag industry has been built on relatively like poor quality data and information flow, and largely because it's so complex as a system, in terms of what it spans and the range of products. And then the fact that, it's built on a global system, but it's also, some of these farms can be half an acre and some can be 100,000 acres. And so the way information has been collected about it and data is gathered is very localized, it's very fragmented. And so I don't think we've spent enough time reflecting on what exactly your food system even is, and where some of these kind of choke points occur. And so I do think that finding these areas where there could be some type of potential exposure and investing in those areas is going to be key. But I do think information becomes a catalyst for that. But also when you're figuring out or trying to redesign supply chains, where do you start from when you've built something on some level of consistency without ever having to kind of look back on? So that's one area that I'm particularly excited about.
Great, wonderful. Sanjeev, do you envision capital drying up in the kind of short and midterm for small businesses? Is that going to be something?
Yes,
I do. What does that look like?
When these things happen, liquidity becomes a real issue, particularly with private capital markets. So when you've got, they call it the denominator effect. So typically what happens is when, the public markets go down, a lot of people have lost wealth, and they have to pension funds, insurance companies, global sovereign wealth funds, wealthy people around the world. So they tend to allocate less to risky assets and tend to prefer assets that are more liquid so they can sell it quickly. And so as a result, when sort of the public markets go down, it has a knock-on effect that's pretty difficult for entrepreneurs and getting risk capital. Now the Fed is acting in a way that is unprecedented and unprecedentedly quick. I think Jerome Powell deserves to be highly complimented in terms of the volume and the scale and the speed of all the tools that he's deployed. So I think there are still some markets in the financial sector, the mortgage market, and some other markets are still negatively impacted. But I think we were going to see a dry up of funding if this continues. And again, if this is structural, it's going to be bad for a while. If it's cyclical, it should come back in Q4, I think.
Let's hope for that, for sure. So Sara, are there concerns that export restrictions due to COVID-19 are going to exacerbate food insecurity?
You're already starting to see the export, restrictions pop up, especially pretty aggressively in the last 48 hours, and definitely have been creeping up over the last week.
Can you give some examples of that?
Vietnam is a good example from yesterday. So I think it's, Vietnam is one of the world's largest producers of rice. So, you definitely will start to see some pain in regions that are net importers from, countries that are producing these crops. And, if you look at top 5 producers of any kind of major commodity and any major crop in the world, the top 5 typically make up something like 70 or 80% of the global production. And so if you have countries shutting down, entire kind of, subsectors of ag, and preventing exports from occurring, it will 100% have an impact on the net importers. And it's just reflected in price, and this is why I mentioned foreign exchange rates earlier, which is, the US is hit hard, but there are many parts of the world that are being hit significantly harder from an economic standpoint because they started from a less economically resilient place than the US started. And so those are areas where you could see hyperinflation just driven by food. I mean, the one thing we aren't, when we think of all the stimulus that's gone into the US and it continues to go into the US economy, it's driven by the fact that the US has been in a relatively very low inflationary environment for a very long time. That's not actually the case in many other parts of the world. And so this could definitely cause some real food security issues.
And I know we're talking about food security issues and national security, but typically if you look at, I mean, there's probably someone on this phone call more knowledgeable than me about it, but typically food inflation leads to significant social unrest, and then political unrest as a result. And there's a lot of data that people on this phone call probably know more than I do about it. So I think watching those figures around food inflation is going to be absolutely critical.
We're actually coming out with a report on food security and national security and some of the risks around that pretty soon.
So here's a question from one of the listeners. I think more for Sara. What are you projecting the top issues facing smallholder farmers in rural communities in the global South?
The food inflation issue is real, right? Because their cost of production is going to go up significantly, i.e., the inputs used to grow the crops, the distribution of those inputs, et cetera, most of that is still imported. Very little is actually domestically produced. So, the currency shocks are going to be very real to smallholder farmers. And also just the overall, you're typically producing enough to feed a family. And if you're actually producing enough to sell some into the market and it's your only source of income, the competitive nature of how you price your product versus other products in the market becomes even more pertinent. And what typically happens is a lot of countries protect smallholder farmers by having very high tariffs on imports. But if you have scenarios here where you already have supplies being blocked from some countries in terms of exports, the only way you incentivize imports is by reducing your tariffs. And so you start to actually create competitive pressure with your smallholder farmers because the volumes of what get imported end up being material and important enough to the country. And so it's going to be a very big balancing act. But I think smallholder farmers in general are going to be impacted just by economic realities and some of the downturn in the economy more than just specific to, their farming needs, if that makes sense.
Sanjeev, do you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Sara said, just in terms of reduced demand. Just some of these markets like coffee. I was on the phone last night with someone that sells cups to a lot of the QSR community. Their demand, their order size demands are like 35 to 50% down for this year, and so that's going to have an impact on like some of the smallholder supply chains like coffee and others. So if Europe and the U.S. are effectively at a standstill, it's going to have real impact on the demand for some of these smallholder products.
So obviously we're eager to kind of get back to work, but one of the questions here is, what should we expect if the U.S. has an early reopening before a vaccine is available?
I mean, we funded a vaccine this week. One of our companies is developing one. It's an RNA platform called Greenlight. So I know more about vaccines than I thought I would 2 weeks ago.
Great.
But I think it's going to take 12 to 18 months. We've also noticed there's a lot of debate right now in academics about how much this virus mutates. We've seen data that does mutate in our vaccine endeavor with Greenlight. So, I think vaccines are 12 to 18 months away. I think we spoke with a bunch of folks in the Epidemiology Intelligence Service, which is part of the CDC that models this stuff out, and then other folks similar like that. And it seems like it's reported on CNN is like you have to flatten the curve. You have to get testing that's ubiquitous. You got to make sure that the healthcare surge is sort of, I know that they're repurposing folks from hotels to hospitals, as surges continue. But I think if we go early and we don't have ubiquitous real-time testing, you're going to probably have, a second wave and a third wave that's as bad as this. So, I mean, I'm not a public health person. I'm more just, I was calling around trying to make sure I'm asking the right questions even. But as an investor, and someone that's, largely going to be negatively impacted in the long term, I think, if we don't get this right, I think it's probably better to be prudent on the front end and try to minimize the second wave and third wave, which will never happen, just because the vaccine will take 12 to 18 months.
Well, wonderful. So I think we're at time now. So I think we're ready to wrap up a little bit. But I would love to give you each just another minute to kind of say anything else, or throw out any other important pieces of this, and then also to ask you both. Of course, you're wearing pajamas from the waist down, right? As we all have been for the past 2 weeks. So just for listeners at home, I'm sure that they want to know that. But yeah, so if you'll each just kind of wrap up with any final thoughts on the food system in light of this tremendous thing that we're all going through.
I mean, I think everyone eats. I think we've got an incredibly dedicated people working on the supply chain. I think for good reason, a lot of the attention has been to healthcare workers for very, very good reasons. And I have a lot of people in my family that are in healthcare and doctors and such. But I also think we need to, remember the folks that are really on the front lines of this from a food production perspective and supply chain perspective, because they're taking risks right now that just to make sure we're all fed. And so I think that's really important to remember that. I come out of this more optimistic about the learnings, building a more resilient system that's hopefully also sustainable and healthy. And the fact that, we can, come away from this better as better companies in our portfolio, better companies, better society. So I'm hopeful, I want to end with the glass half full, if you will, that we're going to build a better food system and also a better sort of economic system that's more resilient.
Wonderful. And Sara?
Yeah, I guess to just kind of take over what Sanjeev said and repeat a bit of that. I think it's a bit of a year of back to the basics, meaning I've never, if I think of how many journalists used to cover ag and food as a topic, you had to be a food and ag journalist to think about it and to care about it. Now, every publication, no matter what the focus is and whether someone's a journalist or not, everyone's become a food and ag journalist. And it's because of just the realization that we actually, there's a lot we can live without. And there's some things we can't live without. And this falls in the category of things we can't live without. And so it's in some ways it's back to the basics. I hope it allows us to appreciate our food systems differently and better. I hope, people kind of ask some of these questions that maybe fewer people in kind of society have asked, but a number of questions I've gotten from my personal friends that never kind of really knew what I did. They're like, yeah, she runs this company. It's a tech company, does ag. And now they're every question they have at a supermarket aisle, they're like texting me, and half of them I can't even answer. But I think it's important.
So we can thank you very much for listening today, and a recording of this event will be made available on the Council's YouTube channel and other social media platforms. And thanks again, panelists.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Yeah.